So the topic that we have is geographies and scales of connectivity. Okay, and so what we would also expect, from our panelists as well as the respondent is a little bit of focus on what those connectivities are, currently, whether they're working on. We mentioned the word boundaries, right? How those boundaries are being challenged, across disciplines and time. But towards the end, the real purpose of this session is also to look at how we can establish new forms of connectivity. And I think the word scale, when I looked at the program and the details of the program, for me the word scale also meant a sense of urgency, that we need to react more quickly or we need to be on the ground faster. And so is that something that we need to look at? But the other is also this two-way nature of connectivity. In Nepal we often have a saying that Nepalese are no longer downloading, but they're also starting to upload. And so, it's sort of in an uploading world, what does connectivity, mean? So without wasting any time, I'm going to give the floor, first to David. And David, again, the bios are all here, but a PhD in geography at the University of Hawaii and the East-West Center. And so, you can be sure that I'm an engineer and I know how to read my time very well. And so maybe I'll give you a warning, maybe 5 minutes left. And then, let's just keep this moving into a real two-way conversation. So David?
Thank you, Neil, and good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm a bit of a map nut, and rarely do I'm in a room with people who are willing to listen to me talk about maps for a little bit, so thank you all for that as well. And the last panelist in the session before us mentioned the omission of maps from his presentation because of time constraints, so I'm going to make up for that as well. So I have several things I plan to do here. But I want to tie my maps to the work that I've been doing and also to the larger questions that this assembly is geared towards solving. So 1737, the Himalayas show up on a map. This is a map by a French cartographer. And it's not much of a cartographic review. They appear of a smudge of squiggles off the edge of the map. But still, nonetheless, they appear. It ushered in really a period of a couple of centuries of exploration, and through a lot of field explorations and studies on the ground, beginning to get a better sense, I guess, of the geography of the Himalaya, locations of places, features of the landscape, features of human society, and so forth. And eventually this sort of evolved within the territorial expansion of empires involving people, some of whom need no introduction. The man on the right, Sir George Everest with the great trigonometric survey. The guy on the left is an interesting character for me. He's an artist and a spy, painter in Kashmir who would conduct surveys up in that western Himalaya region and secret them in the canvases of his paintings and slip them back to London, where they ended up in the archives of the India Office collections. And it was very interesting to go into those collections and take his paintings and look at where he had put those maps and kind of bring all of this to life. It was an enjoyable experience for me. But in the end, what we had was an effort that has continued through time and brings really mapping up into my own work. Beginning in those early days with tripods, amazing feats really, people climbing 20,000, 21,000 foot mountains in a day's work. We have satellites to do a lot of this kind of work these days, and I, in my own work, have employed both kind of ground-based mapping, hand mapping, as well as satellite-based mapping. And in the midst of this, the expansion of frontiers and the mapping of territory, the determination of what's in these landscapes and the identification of boundaries, there's all kinds of contestations that developed among and between different emerging countries in the Himalaya region. And I just have an interesting little aside that links this to my own work. In the late 1990s, I was involved in an ambitious project to assemble a huge amount of data and produce an atlas of the Himalaya. And in the process of doing that, collaborating with people throughout the range, but very importantly, the folks at ICIMOD, Basanta Shrestha and Virendra Bhattacharya, people involved in the GIS and remote sensing programs. So over a couple of year period, collaborating with those folks, and others creating these maps, ICIMOD was interested in it, and they wanted to produce an initial version of the atlas. So I put together materials, and I say I, but actually I'm more of a conceptual cartographer. The real the GIS genius behind all of this was a colleague of mine that isn't here, Gilson Pacheco. But in the end, we put together an array of maps with the assistance of the folks at EasyMode and others. And EasyMode was going to produce and publish the first version, and we sent them to Kathmandu, and they disappeared for about 10 months. And we were wondering what happened to all of this, and then we get emails back and forth, and what basically happened was that they were being distributed and discussed amongst the constituent countries of EasyMode, all of whom have different ideas of where their boundaries are in the Himalaya. And in the end, EasyMode published the atlas without boundaries. So it's an eccentric atlas. You could probably still get your hands on one in Kathmandu. It may be the only atlas that exists that has no international boundaries on it at all. It was the only way they could resolve the differences within the board that was running EasyMode. But there are other things to think about in terms of these boundaries, beyond just my problems with this atlas. Many of us are caught into publication disclaimers if we use maps that involve the Himalaya area. If you want to have them appear in India or China or Pakistan or Nepal, you have to put these kinds of words on these maps. Certainly at a much deeper level, it's involved border conflicts between and among various countries. But also, in another way, a lot of my work has to do with environmental systems, human-environment relations, natural systems, ecological processes, and these, follow rules of their own that have perhaps nothing to do with international boundaries or boundaries within countries. So the dilemma of reconciling land management, landscape ecology-based studies that cross boundaries becomes an issue and crosses borders. And this has kind of evoked different ways to think about landscape and to involve the collaborations of different countries involved. I've just learned from Anil the other day of a new park, Mount Kailas, entering Mount Kailas, which involves the cooperation of China and Nepal and India. An earlier project I was involved with, the Tarai Arc project along the southern Nepal-India border, also involved collaboration between India and Nepal. So in a sense of natural systems work and environmental and ecological systems, landscape ecology-based work, the effort to try to resolve these geopolitical differences to come up with some sort of coherent way of managing the landscape, I think, is an important consideration for us. The term scale comes up a lot, and Neil introduced scale. We've heard it many times. And in my own work, I've moved through various scales, and scale does matter a great deal in terms of mapping, not just mapping, but in terms of the way that we approach a problem and even try to come up with a way of studying it and analyzing it. My earliest work, which continues to a certain extent, has been a village-based approach. And living in western Nepal for a year, for example, weighing bundles of firewood and baskets of fodder and baskets of animal dung, trying to get some kind of empirical handle on relationships between village life and the local natural ecosystems, and how people were conceptualizing their relationship to the landscape in terms of land management and even conservation efforts. So the photograph on the left here is of this village or region within the village, and an area that has experienced and still is experiencing some serious environmental degradation related to slope problems and land management problems and geomorphic processes generally. And then the map on the right, which is a field map, a very crude field map that I produced that was showing how villagers were really setting aside different pieces of land to manage in a particular way. That in fact, this is a village-based conservation approach to land management that had really little to do with outside intervention. It was a way of coming to terms with the changing circumstances of the world and regulating the use of the landscape according to their knowledge of the consequences of their use. In the early to mid 1990s, extending through, I guess, the decades of the 90s, I shifted to a much, much larger scale, actually a regional scale. At that time in geography and associated disciplines, the notion of a Himalaya-wide environmental crisis just around the corner, becoming what was called, I guess loosely, the Himalaya environmental degradation theory. I was involved in a long project to try to get to some kind of a spatial empirical assessment of the validity of that. It's based on a lot of discrete observations, oftentimes roadside observations. And so we were working at a scale that was very different from my earlier work at a village level. We were working with quantitative data sets, empirical data sets that were available oftentimes at political unit scales. But nonetheless, the effort was try to discern patterns across the region that might lead to certain kinds of questions that then could be approached at a more local scale in particular places. So the map you're looking at here is one showing, for example, forest change over periods of time in different parts of the region. Working at both village levels with issues such as landslides and different kinds of environmental events that were posing risks to human livelihood led to interests in natural hazards mapping for me. I have one example of these, which is based upon earthquake potential and land, that type of thing. You know, those of you who spend a lot of time in Kathmandu these days, it's hard not to imagine the consequences of an earthquake. And even myself, when I go to Kathmandu, it has actually affected my behavior, and quite frankly, where I even stay. In terms of, I don't stay on the top floors, high-rise buildings anymore. I try to get within jumping room of the ground and hopefully near an open area, which is kind of bizarre, but nonetheless, it's happening. So for the folks who are living there, you know, you can't think about this. It would just drive you crazy, but it is a very real phenomena. So these kinds of maps are helpful. The one on the left is a region-wide kind of seismicity potential, and the other one has to do with Kathmandu Valley. You know, it's a sediment-based landscape that when it starts to shake can actually liquefy, which is a frightening prospect in many ways when you think about putting structures on that type of a surface. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, my interest in maps started shifting quite a bit, and actually my interest in geography generally started shifting quite a bit. I was interested more in the maps that we hold in our minds, and these maps are maps that not only help us understand the world, but our place in the world, how to navigate through the world. So these are important maps for us. They are part and parcel to our geographical imagination, and they also have an imprint on the landscape, in some cases an inadvertent imprint, in some cases a very conscious, explicit imprint. But nonetheless, the transference of sort of a geographical imagination to a landscape became an interesting phenomena for me. So I went to Shangri-La to look at this. Shangri-La has come up in a number of presentations in New York with the New School. My approach was I went back into James Hilton's book Lost Horizon from 1933, where the word Shangri-La first appeared, and started identifying key descriptors of landscape features that became important in that book, and then went to this area of northwestern Yunnan province that a Chinese geographer had actually determined to be the actual Shangri-La. And the landscape features in that region that correspond or are analogous to fictive landscape features in the book. Kawagebo, for example, is Karakul. Sung Sengling Monastery is Shangri-La Monastery. Yubeng Valley, for example, is the Shangri-La Valley itself. And looking at this, I guess, I have to say in a certain way, as a source of interest for me, curiosity for me. But as I started looking at it in terms of tourism development and to understand how you could take a fictive landscape that's produced in the Western literature and translate it into tourism promotional materials and develop an economy based upon that is quite a remarkable thing that's being achieved. And again, with all kinds of implications, but the photograph on the bottom right suggests that there are some risks when you start to do this, and the features that may be associated with very real cultural identities become amusements. This risk is very much a part of critical tourism literature, and I was simply looking at it in the case of this part of China. I also thought about using photography in a little deeper way. I am a photographer I guess, by inclination, and then by training to a certain extent, a self-taught photographer. But over time, I've spent a lot of serious time working on photography. But one of the ways that I've used photography is through a repeat photography method, where I get old photographs from different parts of the Himalaya, from different sources, the British sources, the American sources, the climbers. In this case, geographer Pradyumna Paul Karan, from Bhutan, 1964, and then going back to that same spot and repeating that spot with a new photograph. What that provides me is a photo pair that, on the one hand, can discern changes in the landscape, which is interesting, and you could actually do a relatively detailed study of that. But I used these more as tools because, on the one hand, locating that perspective was a wonderful process involving local people, using them as guides into the landscape to try to find this perspective to photograph again, but then using the photo pair back in the field as a prompt for life history collections. It was a great way, and is a great way, for people to recall cultural memory. A wonderful way, quite frankly, that can cross generations, and it provided for me a very, very rich source of both landscape information and also ethnographic information in the form of life histories. So that approach I utilized in Bhutan, Kathmandu Valley as well, and over in the Kulu Valley, which were three areas that I had access to old photographs. In the case of Bhutan from the 1960s, but in the case of Kathmandu Valley, working with the family archives of the Chitrakar family, who were the chroniclers of the Durbar, the court of Nepal. Kiranman Chitrakar holds those archives in his house on the 4th floor of his Newari home, a brick house that could topple like a deck of cards, and he's very concerned about the archival issue of holding this record, because it is an enormous historical record. Prior to the advent of photography technology, his ancestors were the painters of the court, so he has also a tremendous collection of very, very beautiful old paintings. So I was able to use his collections, and then in the Western Himalaya, collections out of the Library of Congress and also the Royal Geographical Society. But with essentially the same idea in mind, to see the landscape as a sort of map, and in a way that map then reflects the imprint of humankind on a landscape. I see the landscape as both a repository of human history, and most importantly, the relationship between human history and environmental history, natural history. It's very important for me, that connection that comes through in a landscape, and also to see the landscape really as a mirror of the intentions, historically the intentions of people living in a place, and the creation of that place where they're at. So what I do now is very different than what I was doing 25 years ago, in terms of what I'm interested in and the approaches I take and the methods I use and where I study. But they all, in a certain way now, revolve around the notion of landscapes as maps, the visual production of a mental map as a landscape, and how this then holds certain treasures of cultural memory that can be extracted from the landscape and from photographing the landscape. So, thank you very much.
Okay, so since you encouraged us to draw upon material from our own research, I have decided to present concrete examples and to review the chronology of part of the research I have been carrying out as a geographer in the Himalayas. As you will see, it is linked to changes in scale, and I combine questions from several panels, and this will help to see some of the research trends in my discipline over the past 30 years. Before going any further, I would like to point out that having trained in physical geography, in geomorphology, and having worked within a team of social anthropologists, agronomists, historians, and botanists since I started my research in the Himalayas, I have always privileged an interdisciplinary approach. When I started my fieldwork in Nepal at the beginning of the 80s, research was dominated by what I unmissably call the theory of Himalayan environmental degradation, a theory that emerged in the 1970s with the first research on milieux in the area. To sum up, a catastrophic scenario predicted that given the surge in demographic growth after the 1950s, a growing demand for tree resources as well as for farmland would lead to massive deforestation, hence to a catastrophic increase in soil erosion, the loss of productive lands through accelerated landslide incidents, and the loss of soil fertility, all processes said to cause devastating floods in the Ganges and Brahmaputra plain, floods for which Himalayan peasants have been held responsible. It was predicted that in the year 2000 there would be no accessible forest cover in Nepal, and that the agro-silvopastoral system prevalent there would not have survived. This scenario upheld basic hypotheses for research carried out at the time in this region of the world. And since I myself worked in geomorphology, part of my task was to document it. Well, numerous studies have questioned this catastrophic theory, and much has been written about it. So I will not develop this here, but will only give two examples to show how in-depth studies have questioned this theory. The first example concerns work that was carried out alongside physical investigations about the milieu in geomorphology, climatology, and the like. At that time, results from ecology and physical geography were mainly based on short periods of fieldwork. More often than not, they had no historical depth, and there were few detailed studies to show the relationship between population and their milieu. By combining anthropological and geographical approaches, I have conducted another kind of research. The idea was to stay for a whole year in a village in order to apprehend both the rhythms of nature and the rhythm of society, and above all, their interaction. It was a Tamang village, Salme, in Nuwakot district in central Nepal, where in-depth multidisciplinary research was conducted. Parallel to the geomorphological work, I would say here, one of the outcomes of this research was some work on toponyms or place names. It resulted in a large amount of data, physical, historical, socio-economic, religious, provided by the villagers. Their comments, stories, and anecdotes about the place names were recorded, and other than the meaning of the toponyms themselves, their translation and their symbolization on this map, related data were collected to provide information on the history of the place, its perception, its representation, and for the natural resources mentioned on their use. All this, on this map, all place names are represented by a symbol related to their meanings. Nags, divinities of the soil, as well as places where there is too much water or where there are certain kinds of trees, etc., are mapped. All this has been very useful in understanding the population relationship to its environment, the way people use it, the resources they select, the places they avoid, the link with the divine, in a word, the way they conceive their territory, that is to say here, the space used and appropriated by the population. So, along with other investigations, this studies has shown the intimate knowledge people have of their unstable milieu, the maintenance they carry out on it, as well as a symbolic and religious dimension this milieu has for them. This was a contribution to local knowledge studies that emerged at that time to counterbalance the theory of Himalayan environmental degradation. Yet, the purpose of this study was not to favor local knowledge over scientific data, but to use them to complement each other. A second example that shows the inaccuracy of the theory of Himalayan environmental degradation is a study that focused on Gulmi, Argakanchi, and Palpa district in the western part of Nepal at the end of the 1980s and in the 1990s. There, we tried to move on from monographs to regional studies, working on a regional scale, yet still relying on in-depth studies on village scale. We showed that while the forest has dwindled or has been protected, people have planted a number of trees around their fields to satisfy their needs, constituting in some places a real bocage with dense hedges. They have selected a variety of trees, both for fodder all year round, from trees of the best quality, and for firewood and timber. We recorded more than 50 varieties of fodder triple farms. They secure the slop, they have enabled more cows to be fed, and therefore more milk to be produced, which is sold on the bazaar. What is more, the resource is to be found next to the house. Therefore, the alarmist discourse about the drop in work productivity associated with the decline in forests needed to be reconsidered. The same statement was made at that time by scholars such as Carter, Fox, Gilmour, Fisher, etc. So before going any further, we can see that these two examples highlight 2 points. The first is that depending on the way we consider objects of research, we obtain very different results. The shift since the beginning of research in the Himalayas has been from ecological, biological, or physical studies to environmental studies. This means that the objects studied had not only been ecological, geomorphic, natural, things in themselves, but resources, assets, constraints, risks, implying a double reference to nature and societies. Thus, pastures, forests, trees, landslide, and water are therefore considered from an environmental point of view, that is, as socially invested natural objects. The second point follows on from this one. It refers to the choice of the scale of work, both in time and space, between a global and short-term scale, covering the expert scope more often, which is often disconnected from the population needs, and a local and long-term scale, which helps to provide knowledge while taking into account that of village communities. In the second case I have presented, shifting from forest to tree does not amount to a simple change in scale. The focal distance is not the same, and the results obtained are different. These few elements for consideration touch upon problems raised by microhistory. As Jacques Revel wrote in a book entitled Jeu d'échelle, which can be translated by playing with scale, I quote, "The choice of a particular scale of observation produces effects of knowledge and may be put to the service of knowledge strategies. Adjusting the lens focus not only increases or reduces the size of the object in the viewer, but changes its shape and texture." Or, using another reference system, playing with representation scales in cartography does not come down to representing a constant reality any bigger or smaller, but to transforming the content of the representation, that is to say, the choice of what is representable, unquote. These statements are of particular importance to Himalayan studies, since they have often been accused of being founded on long-term monographs. Yet, when we consider environmental issues, the local scale is essential for understanding situations. Of course, we then have to play around with scale switching from one to another. Now, another stage in the research has been to show that even though the theory of Himalayan environmental degradation has been highly criticized by many scholars, it has so far strongly influenced environmental policies. And this is what I have been studying for a decade or so. One of its main effects has been to operate a clear separation between nature and society on different scales. This is a current trend throughout the world. It is based on an environmental paradigm built at international and national levels and shared by various actors who consider, by and large, that nature has to be protected from societies that will only destroy it, and who therefore claim the need for a clear separation between these two ontologically redefined entities. One of the points I would like to make here is that due in part to these environmental conceptions, over the last 30 years in the Himalayas, we have witnessed a segregation and specialization of space, the setting up of new environmental boundaries, which have led to territorial changes and territorial restructurings. Here, I will not develop what has happened on a village scale. Suffice to say that the agro-silvopastoral system that was still at work in many places of the range in the 80s, and which was characterized by the fact that all milieus, both cultivated areas as well as forests, were put to some use in a complementary manner, so this system has been modified. A strict protection of forests in the 1980s, along with other changes such as demographic growth, a drop in manpower due to the schooling of the young generation, to outmigration and to political conflicts, have led in many places to a restructuring of village territories and of villagers' territoriality. In order to reduce the time needed to access resources, farming activities are now often grouped around the farmstead, fields have been grouped together, common grazing is on the decline, and animals are kept in stalls, with water tanks installed in some places to water the cattle. The forest is used less and less, and we can observe a more distinct separation between forests, which most often are protected, and inhabited or cultivated areas. This situation can be found to varying degrees throughout the central Himalayas. In the eastern Himalayas, in Arunachal Pradesh, for example, where shifting slash and burn cultivation is predominant, over the last decades, there have been projects aimed at abandoning this practice that is seen as a threat to the environment, and at settling populations, which has led to terracing slopes and consequently to a total redefinition of populations' practices and of their territories. Here again, these changes have introduced a new kind of division between society and nature with a specialization of space. Now, on a state scale, since the 1970s, another important consequence of this theory of Himalayan environmental degradation has been the setting up of numerous protected areas, such as national parks, biosphere reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, and the like are on this map with the dam also, in order to protect the environment. They cover more than 30% of the total Himalayan area. In this study, the scale of observation has changed. The whole range has been taken into consideration, even though I still favor a local scale approach for in-depth studies focusing on Kaziranga National Park in Assam. The aim is to look at the ways these protected areas have reshaped the geography of the Himalayas and at what is at stake here. These protected areas also operate a clear divide between nature and society, and one of the points in studying them has been to demonstrate how, as enclaves within states, highlands of nature, and with new environmental borders, they constitute new environmental territories at the heart of debates that are not merely limited to nature protection issues. For me, some aspects of these studies on national parks actually contribute to border studies. And the words written by Willem van Schandel about the border between Bangladesh and India may be applied to them. Part of the study focuses on the internal boundaries constituted by these protected areas and on their meaning. They crystallize many conflicts. For example, these boundaries are often surrounded by the army and are better protected than international borders. There is a kind of battlefield around these boundaries between man and animal, the so-called man-wildlife conflict. They may also be instrumentalized by activists and play the role of other borders. This is a case, for example, of Kaziranga National Park border, where for activists, Hindu nationalists fighting against Bangladeshi migrants, or in other words, against Muslims, the fence surrounding the national park is a replica on another scale of the wall between Bangladesh and India. The lyrics of the following song sung at one of these events illustrates this. Please just pay attention to the last verse. The whole text glorifies nature and Kaziranga National Park, and at the end, we see how it is used. Now, the process is in keeping with the Geography of Hunger by Appadurai, who shows how tension between India and Pakistan appears in mutant forms at various levels and on various scales. This also echoes a study conducted by Emma Maudsley on the case of Terry Dam and the World Hindu Council, a militant nationalist organization whose rhetoric, which is used to protest against the dam's construction, is linked to anti-Muslim action. This association between the green and the saffron is not uncommon in the environmental issues in India. And, as shown by Radmesher and Maudsley, in the Himalayas, ecological degradation has become a metaphor for the degradation of both polity and culture. All these conflicts over protected areas fuel numerous other conflicts in the range, and noticeably those related to claims to autonomous territories. This is a case of the Mishings living on the fringe of Kaziranga National Park, as was the case elsewhere in Assam of the Bodos regarding Manas National Park on the border with Bhutan. Well, over all these years, given the failure of nature protection based on strict separation between nature and society, attempts have been made to solve the problems. Reflection has been fueled by different communities, from actors of development, civil society, to scholars, and several trends have succeeded each other. So, with regard to various conceptions about what environmental policies should be in the Himalayas, we have gone from one explicative story to another one, not to say sometimes from one myth to another. Although they have all contributed some positive aspects and have been helpful in questioning the prevailing theory of Himalayan environmental degradation and in reintroducing society in nature protection policies, they have also shown their limits and pitfalls because they have often been considered indistinctively. This is well documented in Arjun Venerati books about environment in the Himalayas. Well, I would say that today, so there are different problems with the local knowledge and with harnessing region sentiments for the sake of conservation, which might be helpful, but which also is a pitfall. So I would say that today we should be careful about another emerging theory that dominates our research in the Himalayas, that of climate change and its consequences on water resources for the Himalayan population. I am currently working on such project in Nepal, in the Khumbu area. The construction of the climate change scenario is very similar to the construction of the theory of Himalayan environmental degradation. Even though it is based on really alarming data, it is also founded on the same catastrophic discourse. It often holds Himalayan villagers' practice responsible for this climate change. It adopts the same method. There are already hundreds of international organizations acting in this field. And I would add, it is also already generating a lot of business even before enough data have been collected to analyze it. Here again, the local scale is essential for an understanding of the process. We realize this when we work with glaciologists, hydrologists, or those working on models who are actually very far from the local situation. So to end, with regards to the question about whether the Himalayas can be a category for analysis, I will say that over the last 30 years, along with the numerous dams that have been built, protected areas are modifying the geography of the range. On a scale of the Indian subcontinent, the Himalayas are more and more limited to the role of reserve, a cultural reserve, a natural reserve, and a water tower to supply the rest of India. Whatever our scale of observation, we are seeing an accentuation of the split between nature and society. This is true on the scale of the range, like I have shown. Then within the states, with the setting up of protected areas, where there is a split between protected milieux and inhabited milieux. And finally, on the scale of the mountain slopes, where there is a growing split between forests and inhabited and cultivated areas. On another register, though sometimes linked, autonomous territories also take part in this process of differentiation and specialization of space. Thus, in the Himalayas, due to development and environmental policies, some of the population has been displaced, has become outlaws and poachers, and has suffered from degradations caused by wildlife venturing outside the perimeter of protected areas. This is reported throughout the range. In many places, it contributes to a drop in agricultural yields and to people abandoning land. This is one of the problems Himalayan peasants have to face today. I will therefore argue that these aspects of environmental and development policies, here I have given only the negative points, yet there are of course also many positive ones. So these aspects, as well as the conflicts associated with them, have in a way reinforced the Himalayan entity, which in my point of view constitutes a valid category that deserves to be studied within the area and with other areas of the world, and I would add, studies focusing on its internal borders. Thank you. Sorry if I have been long.
I must say it was pleasure listening to all the panel members. As I was sitting down, I was having some trouble trying to frame this 5-minute talk because it's on the fly. So I have made several categories that I think might be useful for us to think through as we discuss the presentations in this panel. And one of the categories that jumped to my mind or the common theme that jumps to my mind is boundaries and scales, but across nature and culture and across different geographical societies. My own work highlights this this particular theme of nature and culture. My work is on snow leopards. I look at the human-wildlife conflict between snow leopards and Himalayan farmer. If snow leopard is one species that really connects the entire Himalayas, not the tiger, not the rhino, the snow leopard that you find from Bhutan to Western Himalayas in Pakistan. So I can perhaps speak of this, this nature-culture dichotomy that has been a very prominent feature of representations of Himalayas and Himalayas environment. In my work, I look at the connection that snow leopard, which is considered a very mythical and elusive creature of the high Himalayas, of the wilderness zone, or of the pristine, representing pure nature, and its connection with domestic economy, that is, local people. And as we have already heard in various presentations, the way the question of environment, the way the question of sustainability is framed, there is an implicit division or implicit boundary that is created between nature and society. And that has led to many wrong prescriptions, perhaps, as well as policies that had afflicted the nations and societies across the Himalayas today. And what I found out in my own work, that in order to sort of bust this boundary, in order to look at the traffic across this artificial boundary, we really need to work at the very basic local level. So then we come to the issue of scales. So in order to bust this myth of nature-culture boundary, which is not only has physical manifestation, but also is the way we conceptualize the world. It's also a metaphysical idea, and hence at a very metaphysical level or metaphysical scale. In order to break this down or challenge it, we need to really go and work at the very basic level. So what I do is I collect snow leopard shit. And I've been collaborating with wildlife biologists, and one of the things that I try to do is, in that shit, I look at how much of its prey is based on domestic livestock. And based on that, one can then argue that this mythical creature is actually dependent on human society. So it turns out about 30 to 40% of snow leopard diet comes from domestic livestock. But the way conservation policies and protectionist policies are construed, they tend to ignore this particular traffic across nature and culture boundary, and think that because snow leopard is this mythical creature, it doesn't have to do anything with the domestic economy. And this ignoring of this problem leads to conflict, which wildlife biologists termed as human-wildlife conflict, but as social scientists, as anthropologists, we call it as human-human conflict over wildlife. So in this panel, I was really heartened to see that we have challenged this particular boundary of nature and culture, be it in the theory of Himalayan environmental degradation, be it in the production of knowledge. And as anthropologist, I can perhaps speak about methodology as well as a theoretical framework that we have used to challenge this boundary. For example, in the theory of Himalayan environmental degradation, political ecology and the role of anthropologists in looking at political ecology has been phenomenal. They have shown that local level environmental degradation are caused by contradiction in policies at global, regional, and national levels. Thus, that has also led to the need for connection across various scales of knowledge, of communities of knowledge, be it the local level, be it the regional level, or at the national level. There is clearly, as we heard from our speaker, there is a need for boundary crossing for all of us. And if I can use the anthropological term, that boundary crossings are usually transformative. They are transformative for us as scholars. So when I work with wildlife biologists, I have to see the world through their eyes. I have to really try to understand and also put myself in this framework that the Himalayas are devoid of any human beings, or there are only wild and natural landscape that needs to be assessed or that needs to be described. And these are very disconcerting moments. At these moments, it is difficult to keep your own disciplinary identity, your own professional identity. And that has, I think, been a big challenge, especially for social scientists. What I have noticed, that we tend to perhaps ignore or we tend to not take many other sciences, for example, physical sciences, for what they are and engage in criticizing them rather than making some pragmatic use of them. But having said that, I think there is more and more literature that is coming out, which is, and especially in anthropology, which is trying to write ethnographies or trying to produce literature which doesn't not only have academic value, but as well as practical value. So for example, in the case of environmental movement and conservation movements, more and more anthropologists are sort of setting aside the basic problem in anthropology of crisis of representation. How do we make representations of, you know, indigenous societies, or how do we represent? And they have sort of left this question aside and now are talking about that perhaps we need to make more representations. We need to make politically astute representations. And in that context, they have, I think, in some ways, been successful at jumping boundaries, collaborating with wildlife biologists, collaborating with historians, collaborating with people, especially in natural sciences. And I think when we're thinking through these papers, it might also be interesting to think about temporal scales, because we are talking about Himalayas, and Himalaya invoke this spatial imagery in our mind. And I think David Zurich, when he was talking about Shangri-La, it was very interesting that a category that was perhaps conjured up 80, 90 years ago in a different time zone is now becoming relevant in the contemporary era. So I guess I'll just end at this. I don't have any specific question to offer. I was asked to perhaps synthesize some of the talks that were presented, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting presentations on the borders, particularly on when you try to contest these borders. You know, there is a very significant, conspicuous and a very tangible trend going on in the entire Himalayan region, vis-a-vis how to transform these borders, which remain totally security-centric so far, into borders of opportunities. And there's a very well-known, very well-planned design by the respective governments, international agencies like ADB, UNESCAP, and World Bank, to really bring such kind of transformations. If you see, starting from the extreme eastern Himalayas, right, there's a very well-planned initiative going on in order to revive the Stilwell Road, built during the Second World War, connecting on the basis of sub-regionalism countries, the geographically contiguous regions like Bangladesh, northeast of India, China, you know, the southwestern part of China, and Myanmar. And if you go in between the middle, the part, you will find linking Nathula with Sikkim with Tibet Autonomous Region. The road is open. And large number of such kind of interactions between Nepal, between Himachal Pradesh and China. And if you go to the western part, you will find a very well-designed program to link Gwadar Port, Karakoram, and Pakistan and the Chinese, right? Now, given this, this is going to, and this is likely to happen in the course of next 10 to 15 years, right? And the plans are already afoot. Agencies are working. Some of the things are already. Now, given this kind of, you know, a set of traditions, a set of interactions existed. Now here are in the name of trade, investment, energy, tourism, transport communications. You have this kind of transformative activities going on. China is bringing railway lines across the other side of the Sikkimese border, railway lines up to Tatopani in Nepal, right in Kutch. What as social scientists, as demographers, and of course as cartographers, what kind of border do you foresee, or what kind of borderland do you foresee in terms of interactions among the people on both sides of the borders? That's my question.
Let me just hold on. Let's take the three, and then maybe there are commonalities. It's just a way to save time.
Thank you for your presentations. I had a question of Joël. I appreciated your talk and your emphasis that all of the succession of policies have tended to reinforce the dichotomy of nature and culture. And as you know, I'm a great fan of Latour. Latour would say that this is not ontologically really doable, and that the monsters will pop up somehow. There will be a monster, that the contradiction of this will emerge somehow. And I wondered, where are the monsters?
Okay.
My question is specifically for David. David, I'm really
Which
impressed.
David?
Excuse me?
Which David?
Oh, Germano. Yes, sorry. Sorry, other David. I want to ask about the ethics of the digital archive and how you deal with the informed consent process when you're doing ethnography to post something online. I've had difficulty with that in the past. Second, how do you deal with the digital divide and the translation of the information on the local level?
Okay. So three good questions. I don't know, maybe Joel, you start? And then we'll just go do it this way. Okay. Mike?
Well, I'll address the first gentleman's question. I don't know in terms of a pan-Himalaya conceptualization of a border, but anecdotally I would say this. Last fall I was up in the Trisuli Valley, where one of these roads is being built by the Chinese, and it's connecting Tibet and Nepal, and it may well be done as we sit here. They were getting very close to it. And shooting off from that road up into Langtang and some of the side valleys, there was a lot of discussion about the impact of the road on the border activities of those people, displacing, for example, small-scale entrepreneurial efforts that were already in place having to do with trade and movements of goods and people and so forth, that these small-scale activities wouldn't be able to economically be viable with the new road. And so the concern then becomes, do you try to position oneself along the roadway and take advantage of this flow, or do you just lose? So these roads, as part of international infrastructures, will connect large regions, but they may well bypass local territorial relationships, would be one reaction to that.
Very good. Joel?
For this road, I would think that, for example, in Northeast India, it will change everything, because Assam or these places which were completely remote, not completely, but which were remote and separated from the rest of India, now they will be linked to the rest of Southeast Asia by the road which is being built now. So it will change a lot, I would think. It is already changing. So for the other question about culture and nature, I would say that actually the point is that anyway, since all this since this split between nature and society is lead to the fact that actually there are many conflicts and more conflicts, and that people now in Kaziranga National Park, for example, where I am working a lot, they don't want to hear any longer about tiger project, about national parks and so on. So, and they are going to, they are just leading activists, and so they are just fighting against that. So it's a real failure. So the point that to not take into consideration the link between nature and culture is really something which is bringing more and more conflict, I would say, in the range. So I will not say more.
Very good. Yeah.
So the first question, I don't think I have anything particularly special to say about, namely informed consent. That is a challenge, especially when you're dealing with people that you have to explain the whole dissemination process that you're asking for permission for. And so what we try to do is explain to them what the consequences of that are, alert them to possible concerns they might have, give them an opt-out strategy, and then also proactively screen the content ourselves for any potential problem, even if they think there isn't. So as far as the digital divide goes, that relates to both production and dissemination. So in terms of production, one thing we've been trying to focus on is we have 3 centers in Tibetan areas in Xining and Chengdu and Lhasa, where we actually have full-time University of Virginia staff who are working with local communities. And so in terms of the production and dissemination side, we have an actual outpost there. And I didn't get to the final slide where I talked about the challenge for why we have so many dysfunctional people within higher education. And I think it's because we keep hiring people that are like us, and because we've created a fetish out of a certain notion of what research is. And so we say, this is research, we're so sorry, minorities and women and all these other people that aren't represented adequately in the academy, you don't qualify, but really that's about our values that have expressed themselves in that configuration of research. And so I would like to see us think about engagement as a category that's part of research and gets factored into promotion, tenure, hiring committees. And so when you're working with local communities on facilitating knowledge production, as well as offering different kinds of programs of engagement, my question would be, is intellectual knowledge uniquely required for that activity? And if it is, then it should count as research. And what's the impact that it's having on the overall state of the integrity and extent of the knowledge that we have? Also in terms of dissemination, to try to build a system, even if those communities don't have online access, if you build a system that has multiple output formats, someone could output those in a form that's appropriate to the technical facility they have. Whether it could be paper, or it could be a DVD, or it could be a thumb drive, or it could be whatever format can be reached to that community. And then you actively take care for that by having university centers in the communities that you have a long-term relationship with. So that's a short answer.
Okay, so we're going to break for lunch, and so I think I'll hand it over to Andrew, but just to do the work of the chair, to really thank our wonderful panelists, the respondent, and also the audience, but also to thank our hosts, for having us all here. So one thing you learn, in all this discussion is that hungry people are angry people. Drag this for too long. Please.
Well, let me just repeat Anil's thanks to these wonderful, rich, and provocative presentations, to the respondents, to our chairs, and to our audience. We are now officially adjourned.